When it comes to Old West feuds, Arizona's Pleasant Valley War ranked among the most violent. Also known as the Graham-Tewksbury feud, this conflict would rage on for over a decade and see a death toll from between 20 to 50 men, some of whom fell at the hands of a notorious killer by the name of Tom Horn. And you better believe this would not be the last feud that Tom was involved in. After leaving Arizona, he'd hire on with the Pinkertons, and it wasn't long before they sent him up to a little place in Wyoming known as Johnson County. Apparently, the cattle barons were getting fed up with rustlers, and they were looking for men like Tom Horn who weren't afraid of getting their hands dirty. Oh yeah, things about to get real bloody on the northern plains. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Back in 1879, a guy by the name of James Tewksbury, along with several of his children, started a small ranch in Arizona's Tonto Basin, or to be more specific, Pleasant Valley. Now, the exact location of Pleasant Valley can be a little confusing. According to some, Tonto Basin and Pleasant Valley are one and the same. Others maintain that the valley is just a subsection of the basin, while still others claim that it's adjacent and separate from the basin. My very rough understanding is that the town of Young, Arizona, just due south of the Mogollon Rim, marks the valley's northern boundary. It's flanked to the east by Canyon Creek, to the west by the Sierra Anchas, and extends all the way south to Globe, Arizona, or thereabouts. Not a lot in this region even to this day. A beautiful yet rugged area that also just happens to be in very close proximity to Fort Apache and the San Carlos Reservation. This would have been extremely remote in the latter part of the 19th century, and due to the prevalence of Apache breakouts in the 1880s, downright dangerous. And yeah, it was in such an environment where the Tewksburys and a handful of other brave souls would ultimately settle. More about that in a moment, but I'm excited to tell you all about today's sponsor, MyHeritage, the #1 global service when it comes to both family history research and DNA testing. MyHeritage not only makes building your family tree a simple and enjoyable activity, but it also gives you access to powerful tools that can aid in your research, including over 19 billion easily searchable historical records. Check this out, this is my tree. As long as you know the names of your parents and your grandparents, MyHeritage does the rest. Once you enter in that information, they'll automatically add discovery links, which you can click on to get suggestions on how to grow your tree. For instance, let's say I want to add an entire branch to my tree with just the click of a button. I'll go up here to Discoveries and choose Instant Discoveries. Look at that. You can also go in and manually add photos, like this guy right here. Thanks to MyHeritage, I found out that he fought in the Civil War. My grandma actually knew him. How cool is that? I know someone who knows someone who fought in the Civil War. So why wait? Sign up for a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage now by clicking the link down in the description or scanning the QR code and enjoy all of the features that MyHeritage has to offer. All right, let's get back to the story. It wasn't until 1881 when the valley's first large herd of cattle was brought in by rancher Jim Stinson. And it was Stinson who caused the initial rift between the Tewksburys and their neighbors, the Grahams. Believe it or not, the two families started off on very friendly terms. Hell, it was James Tewksbury's son Ed, or Edwin, who invited the Grahams to come check out the valley in the first place. And upon arrival, the Tewksburys even helped him to build their cabin. In time, both families would work closely with one another on various other projects. The only problem was Jim Stinson, the guy I mentioned a moment ago with that large herd, began suspecting the members of both clans were stealing his livestock, which, as it turns out, they probably were. But hell, in all fairness, so was everybody else. You see, Stinson had about the most plain, easily altered brand you can imagine. The letter T. Everybody with a damn running iron was dipping into his herd and changing the brand to their own, including men working for the much larger Hash Knife outfit to the north, aka the Aztec Land and Cattle Company. Hash Knife Cowboys were all about half outlaws their own damn selves, and they would often raid the herds in nearby spreads to supplement their income. And then, of course, he also had a legit criminal presence. With Pleasant Valley being as rugged and remote as it was, it did become a haven of sorts for all manner of thieves, outlaws, and killers. Toss in a few thousand head of sheep, and you've got prime ingredients for a good old-fashioned Wild West feud. Now, things really kicked off officially in January of 1883 when Jim Stinson sent his foreman, a guy by the name of John Gilliand, over to the Tewksbury Ranch. Now, sources do differ. There are some that claim that Gilliand was attempting to arrest Ed Tewksbury, while others maintain that he was just coming to smooth things over. Whatever the case, words were exchanged and guns were drawn. Ed managed to plug two of Gillian's companions, and that was about it. The would-be posse skinned out to lick their wounds. Following this development, Stinson instead employed a divide-and-conquer type strategy. Rather than go in guns a-blazing, he instead made a deal with the Tewksbury's friends, the Graham family, even paid them off in cattle in order to dig up dirt on their neighbors, the Tewksburys. As you can imagine, the Tewksburys considered this an act of betrayal, and more violence ensued. Things further escalated in 1885 when the Tewksburys brought in a large herd of sheep, which at that time was a big no-no in cattle country. By the way, how fun is it to say the word Tewksbury? Tewksbury. They don't even sound like ranchers. With a family name like Tewksbury, I just imagine them living in a shire somewhere, maybe with a bunch of hobbits running around, just singing songs and doing Tewksbury activities. I don't know. Now, as for Jim Stinson, the man who started this entire damn feud, he got his fill as early as 1884 and moved out of the area. The damage was done, though, and the bloodshed would continue for another 8 years, with the Tewksburys and the Grahams, along with their various allies, just slugging it out. As far as Tom Horn and his involvement, well, that does still remain somewhat of a mystery. Remember, Tom first came to Arizona in 1881 and found employment as a civilian packer for the Army during the Apache Wars. Worked his way up to the chief of scouts, and after several years of chasing Geronimo on both sides of the border, he finally settled down in the Aravaipa Canyon, some 50-odd miles south of Pleasant Valley. Tom wouldn't make his presence known in the valley proper until the spring of '87, and according to him, he was simply brought in to act as a mediator. Quote, early in April of 1887, some of the boys came down from Pleasant Valley, where there was a big rustler war going on and the rustlers were getting the best of the game. Things were in a pretty bad condition. It was war to the knife between the Cowboys and the rustlers, and there was a battle every time the two outfits ran together. I was the mediator and was a deputy sheriff. End quote. Indeed, Tom would claim to have held 3 badges from 3 different county sheriff offices simultaneously during this period. I don't know how true that is, but he was most definitely, for sure, deputized there in Gila County. And as far as him being a mediator, this was backed up by his old mentor, Al Sieber, who stated that Tom refused to align himself with either side, despite both factions offering to pay him. William Colcord, yet another Pleasant Valley rancher, claimed that Tom's main purpose was to assist in the, quote, cleanup of the valley after Graham and Tewksbury had quit fighting, end quote. He may have also been employed as a range detective. This theory is supported not only by Pleasant Valley locals, but also Tom's own brother, Charlie, who stated that he was, quote, employed as a detective by prominent cattle and sheep men in Arizona. As for Horn himself, when speaking to a reporter years later, he would say that he had killed men throughout Arizona, first as a scout, then as a detective and a regulator in a campaign against cattle thieves, which I can only assume he was referring to the troubles there in the Tonto Basin. It also appears that during this time, Horn was a member of a vigilante group there in Pleasant Valley known as the Committee of 50. Although this secretive organization claimed to be neutral in the feud, Ed Tewksbury was a member, so I'm sure you can sort out which way their loyalty went. Story goes that Tom would assist these vigilantes in the lynching of at least 3 men. He's also suspected in taking part in the death of Graham family ally, Martin Blevins. Apparently, Mr. Blevins left home one day in search of some horses, and not only did he never make it back, but his body was never discovered. Like I said, Tom is a suspect, and he certainly had the skill set. However, much like a real G, Tom Horn moved in silence like lasagna. He wasn't bragging, that is. All total, Tom would spend about 2 years operating there in Pleasant Valley. The leader of the vigilantes, Glenn Reynolds, would get himself elected as sheriff of Gila County in November of 1888, and Tom would continue to stay on as his deputy, at least for a little while. Interestingly enough, Sheriff Reynolds would be killed by the Apache Kid just a year later as he was transporting him to prison. Now, if you're looking to learn more about the feud there in Pleasant Valley, I do have an episode I released long ago on Commodore Perry Owens, hosted by my good friend Michael, in which he goes way more in depth on the war. Link down below if you're interested in checking that out. As far as I can tell, the last shot of the Pleasant Valley War was fired in August 1892. Only 2 men remained from either family, Edwin Tewksbury and Tom Graham. And, well, let's just say that after the gun smoke finally cleared, Ed Tewksbury was the last man standing. Of course, by then, Tom Horn was no longer in the picture. Hell, truth be told, he wasn't even in Arizona. He was much further north in Wyoming, getting involved in yet another infamous feud known as the Johnson County War. Now, we're going to get to that, but first, we got to talk about the Pinkertons, the organization that would ultimately be responsible for setting Horn loose on Wyoming. Not long after the death of Sheriff Reynolds, Tom moved back to the Aravaipa Canyon and resumed his career as a ranch hand and part-time prospector. It was there where he was recruited by a Colorado sheriff and Pinkerton operative named Doc Shores. Doc had tracked a pair of horse thieves all the way down to Arizona, and it just so happened that Horn personally knew both of the accused. In the course of just a few hours, Tom located each man and took him into custody, one at a time, without incident. Now, as to why Tom was so willing to help, I'll once again defer to the expert Larry D. Ball. In his book, Tom Horn in Life and Legend, Professor Ball writes, quote, "Horn could always be counted on to assist law enforcement officers. In part, his cooperative attitude stemmed from the loss of his startup herd to rustlers a few years earlier. Indeed, Burt Dunlap, one of Tom's business partners, described Horn as more down on thieves and thievery than any man I have ever known." End quote. Furthermore, Tom himself would later state that he had a natural hatred for men that steal and those that follow a crooked life. A very interesting philosophy considering his actions later on. We'll get to that soon enough, but needless to say, Sheriff Doc Shores was thoroughly impressed with Horn's efficiency. So much so that he convinced Tom to apply for a job with the Pinkertons, as he, Doc, personally recommended Horn to the main boss up there in the Denver headquarters, a guy by the name of John McParland. And McParland was impressed as well. I mean, think about it. On paper, Tom Horn had a pretty solid resume. Government contractor and scout for the better part of a decade. Experienced as a deputy sheriff. A hatred for thieves in general, and I think this was a big part of it too, but a very solid reputation as a cowboy. After all, much of the work that Horn would be doing for the agency would be undercover, and oftentimes Tom would pose as a cowpoke or just a common laborer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Josh, what in the hell are the Pinkertons? The Pinkertons, who, by the way, are still currently in operation, so I better watch what I say, got their start back in the 1850s with Scottish-born patriarch Alan Pinkerton. Started his own private detective agency in Chicago, and not long thereafter, his people were providing personal security to President Abraham Lincoln, sort of a precursor to what's now the Secret Service. The Pinkertons played a critical role in gathering intelligence during the Civil War, and were one of the first, if not the first, of such organizations to utilize female operatives. And in the years that followed, the Pinkertons would only continue to grow, offering their services not only as investigators, but also as private security and contractors. They chased after such notable bandits as Jesse James and Butch Cassidy, and at the height of their power, the Pinkertons had more agents than the U.S. military had soldiers. To quote the great Ian McShane from HBO's Deadwood, the Pinkertons are muscle for the bosses, as if the bosses ain't got enough of a fucking edge. And that is pretty much the truth. Back in Tom's day, the Pinkertons acted as personal enforcers for the rich and powerful, doing everything from chasing bandits on behalf of the railroad barons to breaking up striking workers for large corporations. Just pretty much any dirty deed that needed doing for those with deep enough pockets to pay. Sometimes their actions were within the bounds of the law, and other times, well, you'd be better off not to ask too many questions. Like I said, Tom did apply and he did get the job. Reported to the bosses there in Denver in April of 1890 to begin his training. Believe it or not, each new detective had to undergo sort of a probationary period, during which time they'd become familiar with the company handbook, as well as learning how to track expenses and just brushing up on the various tricks of the trade. And since Tom would be going undercover, he'd have to learn an investigative technique known as making the rounds, something that one of his co-workers, Charlie Siringo, had absolutely perfected. In short, making the rounds was pretty much what it sounds like. You'd pose as an outlaw or even just a working stiff cowboy and roam from saloon to saloon gambling and drinking, hopefully picking up valuable intel and or working your informants as the night progressed. Not gonna lie, sounds like a pretty nice job other than the part about being a snitch. As it turns out, though, it may have been a little too much for Tom Horn to handle. Fact of the matter is, on his very first undercover job, Tom would get so carried away in the role that he would find himself under arrest for armed robbery. Oh boy. Now, this job in question had him posing as a railroad employee, just working his way down the line from Oregon to Reno, Nevada, investigating a recent train derailing. I guess the powers that be thought that maybe it was done intentionally, and Horn, operating under the alias of Tom Hell, was to nose around and see what he could find out. Once in Reno, Tom began making the rounds. Only problem was he wasn't worth a damn when it came to gambling. It wasn't long before he lost all of his expense money, and then he possibly, allegedly, robbed a faro game of several $100s. The police were called, and within a matter of minutes, they located Tom trying to board a train. They also found the mask, a Smith & Wesson revolver matching the one used by the thief, and $270 in cash, roughly half of what was stolen. Now, for what it's worth, Tom would steadfastly deny his involvement, but be that as it may, he was still arrested and tossed in jail. You'd think that this would jeopardize his new job with the Pinkertons, but I reckon they were used to their employees having questionable morals. Rather than fire Tom, they simply posted his bail and sent him on a new assignment down in New Mexico. And when Horn did travel back to Reno for his court date, the judge ended up declaring a mistrial and setting a new date for the following month. And this time, after the second trial, the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty. Important to note that William Pinkerton, son of founder Alan Pinkerton, had attended this second trial in person. And there are some who think that old Willie Boy spread around enough money to ensure Tom's acquittal. An allegation further backed up by Charlie Siringo, who later stated, quote, "William A. Pinkerton told me that Tom Horn was guilty of the crime, but that his people could not afford for him to go to the penitentiary while on their employ." End quote. So who knows? I do personally think there's a good chance Tom was guilty, despite his supposed hatred of thieves. There's just too many coincidences as far as I'm concerned. But hey, we don't know for sure, and like I said, Tom was found innocent. Following the trial, Tom returned to Colorado and began investigating a train robbery. The main suspects, a loose coalition of thieves known as the Wet Mountain Gang, had made off with around $3,600 from a train outside of Cotopaxi, Colorado. Tom was joined in the field by Doc Shores, and they trailed one of the main suspects all the way to the town of Trinidad, where they ended up getting crossways of the local law. After initially joining forces with the Los Animas County Sheriff and one of his deputies, Ed Black Bill Kelly, Tom and Doc grew suspicious. Guess they felt like Black Bill was in cahoots with the outlaws and leading them on a wild goose chase. An argument erupted, during which Tom Horn flat out threatened to kill Deputy Kelly. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, but Tom and Doc were forced to return to Denver empty-handed, only to later find out that Kelly was on the up and up. Of Tom's lack of discretion, Doc Shores would later write the following, quote, "I was disappointed in Tom's, willingness to shoot down Black Bill in cold blood and was beginning to think that perhaps I had been wrong in recommending him." End quote. Oh boy, so there you go, old Doc Shores thinking maybe that Tom Horn isn't cut out to be a Pinkerton. And this would not be the end of him second-guessing this referral. The hunt continued as they followed the bandits down to New Mexico and up into Oklahoma. And according to Doc, Horn's behavior grew even worse. Quote, "Tom was more and more showing a side of his character that I had never seen before. On comparatively short trips, he had been cooperative, full of stories, and a pleasant companion. On a long trail, he was moody, insisted in his own way, and wanted the best of everything." End quote. Doc would also state that Horn would oftentimes clam up and act as if he was angry at the world, just brooding over something, and that he, Doc, made it a point to never work with Tom again after this assignment. Guess he figured that Horn was a piss-poor travel companion on top of being hot-headed. Finally, towards the end of October 1891, they arrested one of the main suspects in the train holdup, Bill Curtis, over in Washita, Oklahoma. Found him asleep on a boarding house porch and took him into custody without having to fire a shot. Bert's partner, the awesomely named Pegleg Watson, was down in Texas at the time and not due to return for a few days, so Doc Shore returned to Denver with Curtis, as Horn and a Washita deputy laid in wait. Sure enough, just a few days later, here comes Watson, and he too was arrested without incident. In no time flat, Doc was back in Denver, and much to the irritation of Doc Shores, bragging to the local papers about how he and he alone was responsible for the capture of both men. Now, these were not the only suspects who were forced to pay the piper. In the days that followed, both Horn and Shores would arrest others who helped out in the train robbery. One of them, Joe McCoy, Tom had to track all the way down to Utah. According to Pinkerton Superintendent McParland, the apprehension of McCoy was the most important arrest made for a long time in this part of the country. Once the Cotopaxi investigation was wrapped up and all of the robbers convicted, Tom was sent on a brand new assignment up in Wyoming, a little place you might have heard of called Johnson County. Now, I have already covered the Johnson County War in a previous episode. Check out the series I did on Frank Canton if you'd like to learn more. But just in case you're a new listener, or maybe you'd like a refresher, I will give a brief overview. Located southeast of the Bighorn Mountains in north-central Wyoming, just about 50 miles south of the Montana line, Johnson County was and is a cattleman's paradise. I know I've said it before, but they don't call Wyoming the Cowboy state for nothing. And that seems doubly true for Johnson County. Back in those days, the 1880s and 1890s, thanks to the Homestead Act, if a man had enough guts and grit, he could lay claim to 160 acres of prime Wyoming real estate. So long as you made improvements on said land and managed to hang on to it for at least 5 years, it was yours, free and clear, minus a small registration fee. Only thing is, it weren't just the small-time ranchers getting in on the action. You had a lot of big money flooding into Wyoming as well, some of it from back. Only thing is, it wasn't just the small-time ranchers getting in on the action. You had a lot of big money flooding into Wyoming as well, some from back east and some from as far away as Europe. These are what we now call cattle barons, i.e. large ranchers who grazed their massive herds of cattle on all that wide open land. They were there first, for the most part, and didn't much care about sharing with the small homesteaders, or nesters as they called them. And to further exasperate matters, the homesteaders began stringing up barbed wire. Keep in mind that this was all done legally. These smaller outfits had every right to settle where they were settling, and there was no rule saying that they couldn't fence their own land. Problem was, the cattle barons still considered that land theirs, despite what the law had to say. In order to protect their interests, the wealthy ranchers formed something known as the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, or the WSGA for short, a quasi-governmental organization that was essentially just calling all the shots there in Wyoming. According to Bill O'Neill, author of the book Johnson County War, quote, "Like medieval nobles, they controlled vast domains, and like medieval nobles, they rode horseback, booted and spurred across their land. Other mounted men, the proud and picturesque cowboys, rode for them and tended their great herds. Masters of men and cattle and land, the big ranchers were also pioneers in an enormous, harsh, and nearly empty country. The cattle barons brought capital to Wyoming and provided economic, political, and social leadership. As Wyoming Territory developed economically, the big cattlemen provided a great majority of that development, more than the Union Pacific, the federal government, and coal mining combined." End quote. So yeah, a lot of big money and power involved there in Wyoming in the late 1880s. And these wealthy ranchers sure as hell didn't need a bunch of broke-ass cowboys and small-time outfits muddying up the waters and putting up fences. At first, they attempted to brand the homesteaders as cattle thieves, but when this didn't work, the WSGA simply took matters into their own hands. There is a lot more involved, as usual. Like I said, check out the series I did on Frank Canton, but in time, the WSGA would resort to waging a war on the smaller ranchers, whom, like I said, they labeled as rustlers. And when I mean wage a war, they literally invaded Johnson County with a small army of hired killers. Killers that had a hit list full of names they were to eliminate. And just to be clear, I have no doubt that there was a legitimate issue in Johnson County when it came to rustling. There was even a small bunch known as the Red Sash Gang, that we'll talk about here in a little bit, that were absolutely for a fact cutting beef from the cattle barons. That said, for the most part, 99% of the people accused of being rustlers by the WSGA were honest, hard-working cowboys and ranchers. Hell, in Johnson County, it was considered a badge of honor to be labeled as a rustler. Didn't mean that you were a stock thief, just meant that you weren't a bootlicker for the WSGA. Case in point, Jim Averill and Cattle Kate Watson. During the summer of 1889, they were both taken from their homes, trussed up, and summarily hanged. Their bodies left swaying at the end of the ropes. Story goes that not only was Kate a cattle rustler of epic proportions, but also a prostitute. A Dr. Charles Penrose, who would participate in the upcoming Johnson County War, stated that Watson was a, quote, "cowboy harlot who took her pay in stolen cattle and yearlings. She is, without shame, has a vile tongue, and had to be killed for the good of the country." End quote. Hell, I was even able to find an encyclopedia article from as recently as 1977 that listed Cattle Kate as being a notorious prostitute who prospered by establishing a body house in Sweetwater, Wyoming, where cattle was the medium of exchange. And as it turns out, nothing could be further from the truth. The only crime that Jim and Kate were guilty of was owning land that the WSGA wanted for their own. One of the cattle barons and influential WSGA member, Alan Bothwell, had made several attempts to buy him out, but they refused. First, the couple was blacklisted, which meant they'd no longer be able to register their brand, and then Bothwell sent his cowboys in to harass them. When none of that worked, they were simply executed. And yeah, Bothwell did ultimately acquire their land. Guess sometimes it pays to be a murdering son of a bitch. And after that, the bodies just kept stacking up. Next to go was WSGA range detective George B. Henderson. His death in October of 1890 was considered to be in direct retaliation over the lynchings of Jim Averill and Cattle Kate. Speaking of lynchings, a few months later, one of the smaller ranchers, Thomas Wagoner, was strung up in a similar fashion, and on it went. Skip ahead to September of 1891, and an attempt was made on the life of WSGA rival Nate Champion. Now, Nate was a man's man, and by all accounts, just an honest, hard-working cowboy. But he weren't no WSGA crony. In fact, Nate had recently been named as the head of the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association, a group formed as an opposition to the WSGA. Although 4 gunmen were able to sneak into Nate's cabin while he was asleep, the tough cowpoke was able to fight him off. Sadly, one of his fellow cowboys, Orley Ranger, wouldn't be so lucky. Less than a month following the attempted killing of Champion, Orley was assassinated outside of the town of Buffalo. A couple of days later, yet another blacklisted cowboy and WSGA opponent, John Tisdale, was likewise dispatched. Just like Ranger, Tisdale was shot from ambush shortly after leaving Buffalo. 4 months later, in early April of 1892, is when the WSGA would launch that full-scale attack on Johnson County that I mentioned earlier. And the first name on their hit list was the aforementioned Nate Champion. The invaders, as they'd come to be known, ended up surrounding Nate's cabin, and at first light, they killed his partner, Nick Ray. Champion managed to hold out for several hours, but it was 50 against 1. As soon as they set fire to his cabin, Nate emerged, guns ablazing, and he too was cut down. Yet another good man dead, and the name agreed. Next morning, the invaders set their sights on the actual town of Buffalo, but soon learned that the citizens were not only armed and ready, but pissed off to boot. Rather than risk an attack, the vigilantes instead fell back to the TA ranch and began preparing for a siege. Not long thereafter, the tables were turned when around 200 of Johnson County's finest showed up at the ranch packing dynamite and looking to avenge Nate Champion. And they likely would have too had it not been for the intervention of the U.S. Army. In the end, the invaders were taken into custody by the military, but despite the cold-blooded murder of Champion and Ray, they'd ultimately be set free. After all, money talks, right? Now, while this invasion is considered a defining moment of the Johnson County War, it did not mark the end of the hostilities. Less than a month after the siege there at the TA Ranch, a deputy U.S. Marshal by the name of George Wellman was shot and killed from ambush. Then, on June 17th, a fight broke out between Johnson County residents and the U.S. Cavalry, who'd been sent in to keep the peace. The ensuing fight, known as the Battle of Suggs, resulted in the death of at least one trooper, and this was followed by the killing of Nate Champion's brother, Dudley, in May of 1893. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does all this have to do with Tom Horn? Well, according to Horn biographer Jay Monahan, prior to the invasion, some of the head honchos from the WSGA had traveled to Denver to seek assistance from the Pinkertons. The agency agreed to help, for a price of course, and they sent Tom Horn north to Wyoming, once again undercover and using the alias of Tom Hell. That said, much like with the Pleasant Valley War, Tom's role in Johnson County is very much shrouded in mystery. There are some who think that it was Horn who assassinated John Tisdale and Orley Ranger back in December of '91. Furthermore, one of the Johnson County invaders, William Walker, would later claim that Horn was present when Nate Champion was killed. This is most likely not true, though, as Tom was not part of that bunch arrested by the Army at the TA Ranch. Also, just 4 days after Nate's death, Horn was back in Denver helping to arrest a pair of fugitives. As for Tisdale and Ranger, maybe, but there was another suspect as well, former sheriff of Johnson County, Frank Canton, and I do think he had a lot more in the way of motivation. Also, it's worth mentioning that at this juncture of Tom Horn's life, it doesn't really look like he had yet resorted to acting as a cold-blooded killer for hire. According to WSGA ringleader William Irvine, Tom Horn, quote, had nothing to do with the invasion proper, nor was he even in the employ of our crowd, end quote. This was also backed up by Tom's fellow detective, Doc Shores. Truth is, as far as the evidence is concerned, Tom's main involvement was just helping the WSGA recruit gunmen, at least initially. And even then, it was Frank Canton who went down to Texas and signed up the 40 or so men who comprised the bulk of the Johnson County invaders. It wasn't until after the invasion, in May of 1892, that Tom Horn, aka Tom Hell, was commissioned as a deputy there in Wyoming under U.S. Marshal Joseph Rankin. And it was during this period, the summer of '92, when Tom was most active in Johnson County. Make no mistake about it, though. Deputy U.S. Marshal badge or not, he was there as a Pinkerton under contract by the WSGA. Per author Larry D. Ball, quote, Horn was first a Pinkerton detective and second a federal lawman. If Horn's duty for the cattlemen in Johnson County coincided with Marshal Rankin, there would be no trouble. If a conflict arose between the two missions, Horn would fulfill his Pinkerton assignment first. End quote. Even Tom himself would make no bones as to his true allegiance, going so far as to tell Marshal Rankin to his face, quote, "I will be frank with you and state that I am instructed through my office in Denver, meaning the Pinkertons, to take no instructions from you whatever, that the cattlemen are our clients." End of quote. As you can imagine, Tom wasn't all that much help to the good Marshal. Although their goals were similar, to help put an end to the rustling of stock there in Johnson County, it was their tactics that were at odds with one another. Whereas Rankin was looking to arrest the thieves, along with those responsible for Deputy Wellman's murder, and see him prosecuted, Horn instead was happy with just running them out of the area. According to Tom, quote, "My instructions were to drive these men out of the country and not arrest them." End of quote. Not to say that Tom didn't arrest anybody during the summer of 1892. He absolutely did. It just didn't occur with the speed or efficiency that Marshal Rankin would have preferred. In late July, Tom and a few other deputies exchanged gunfire with outlaw Ed Starr before taking him into custody, and then just a month later, he helped apprehend Kid Donnelly, one of the suspects in Marshal Wellman's murder. A few days later, oddly enough, Tom would even help the army by tracking down a deserter. As far as Horn's methods of driving rustlers out of the area, I couldn't really find anything in the way of specifics. Like I said a minute ago, it doesn't really look like Tom was actively engaged in killing anybody, but he also wasn't above doing a little bit of old-fashioned harassment. To once again quote Larry Ball, it appears that Horn was already pursuing the tactics that he would employ for the next decade in the interest of the big livestock owners. It was more expedient to terrorize and drive suspected rustlers out of Wyoming than to go to the expense of attempting legal action. But there is no indication that he had yet contemplated the ultimate solution, assassination. End quote. And yeah, the big word here being yet. By the way, I know I keep quoting Mr. Ball quite a bit, but his biography on Tom Horn is excellent. If you get a chance, I would highly suggest you picking up a copy. Tom Horn, Life and Legend. So the main culprits when it came to the legitimate stock theft there in Johnson County, the Red Sash Gang, were also the ones who had murdered Deputy Marshal Wellman, allegedly. Unlike the majority of the ranchers and cowboys labeled as rustlers, these Red Sash boys were indeed true blue criminals. And credit where credit's due, Tom was somewhat successful in cleaning them out. Not only did he help to arrest Kid Donnelly and Ed Starr, but by August 1892, the gang's ringleader, Charlie Taylor, had fled the country entirely. Now, this next little chapter of Horn's life is a little murky, but the long and short of it is, he lost his job with the Pinkertons. And sadly, it doesn't really look like there's a definitive answer as to why. According to Tom, he quit on his own accord as he, quote, "never did like the work." This is somewhat supported by Doc Shores, who claimed that it was the snitching on railroad employees that Horn objected to. Apparently, part of his job entailed bribing train conductors and others who worked for the railroad. If they accepted, he'd turn them into the bosses, and then, of course, they'd be fired. Not really sure how much of this he was doing, while at the same time working for the cattlemen up there in Johnson County, but it was absolutely part of the job. Hell, there were even times when Horn would go undercover on the rails as a hobo, just in order to catch people accepting bribes. That said, Charlie Siringo tells a different story. According to him, Tom was fired for being too rough. Interpret that how you will. I'll say this much though, rough does not necessarily equate to murder. I've heard other sources claim that Siringo implicated Horn in the assassination of Orley Ranger and John Tisdale up there in Johnson County, and that William Pinkerton had told him personally that Tom was guilty of the crime. This quote does appear to often be taken out of context, though. If you read Charlie Siringo's book, Two Evil Isms, he's not writing about the killing of Tisdale and Ranger, but rather, as I alluded to earlier, that faro game that Tom allegedly robbed over in Reno. Speaking of William Pinkerton, according to him, Tom got fired for excessive drinking. Guess he was warned several times and finally told in no uncertain terms that if he showed up drunk again at the headquarters there in Denver, he'd be fired. But who's telling the truth? Or could it have just been a mixture of all three? I'll tell you this much, me personally, I wouldn't trust William Pinkerton, Charlie Siringo, or Tom Horn as far as I could throw them. I mean, who are we kidding? These three ain't exactly wells of unvarnished truth. That said, Tom did like to drink, and as the years progressed, his drinking would increase. Also, as you'll soon come to learn, Tom would get a little heavy-handed when it came to imposing his will on others. Nevertheless, whatever it was that caused Tom to part ways with the Pinkertons doesn't really seem to have harmed his reputation too much there in Wyoming. By the fall of 1893, he had already found employment in the southeastern portion of the state as a range detective for the Swan Land and Cattle Company, the first successful ranch in the United States to raise freshwater domesticated swans. Apparently, they taste just like chicken, and there was a huge market for them up in Canada. And no, that's not true. In all actuality, the company was named after its founder, Alexander Swan. Mr. Swan had first come to Wyoming back in 1874 and settled down on Chugwater Creek, about 45 miles north of Cheyenne. And by the time that Horn arrived, Swan had built a damn cattle empire. I'm talking the dude owned millions of acres there in Wyoming. I don't know how it was in 1893 when Tom began working for him, but as early as 81, Swan was said to have owned at least 100,000 head of cattle. He was also a politician, aka crook, had served in the territorial legislation, and was an active member of the WSGA. What's more, his ranch manager, John Clay Jr., was the damn president of the WSGA. And it was this John Clay who ultimately hired our very own Tom Horn, I think. Once again, a little confusing, but during this period we're about to discuss, Tom is not just working for Clay and the Swanland and Cattle Company, but also for the WSGA in general. Doesn't really matter though, because despite his employer, the duties were pretty much just that of a range detective. Same type of stuff he had been doing up in Johnson County, just keeping track of the boss's cattle and reclaiming any that he found in somebody else's possession. If you've ever seen 1980's Tom Horn, starring Steve McQueen, this is somewhat accurately portrayed. Tom was patrolling all over, mostly at night, but he wasn't afraid to go riding up onto somebody else's property, and by somebody else I do mean the small homesteaders, and inspect their herds. Just seeing if any of the cattle belonged to his employer or other members of the WSGA. Those who were in possession of stolen cattle, or those just suspected of being thieves, were oftentimes given cryptic notes telling them to clear on out of the county or else. That said, I do want to make it clear, once again, at this point in the timeline, there's still no indication that Tom had yet resorted to outright murder. However, this would be changing very quickly. For now, though, it's the fall of 1893, and Tom's job was to simply collect information on the cattle thieves, hopefully help to build a case, and if possible, arrest them and see them prosecuted. One notable apprehension occurred in November as Horn was investigating a lady by the name of Eva Langhoff, who was suspected of butchering cattle that did not belong to her. Story goes that Eva was having the cows delivered at night and would then slaughter them in her barn. And it was in said barn where Tom and a small posse caught Eva red-handed. Literally. Her and 4 of her accomplices. All 5 were arrested, but as it turns out, the results weren't exactly what Tom and his boss, John Clay and the WSGA, were hoping for. Eva Langhoff was acquitted outright, and only one of her 4 partners was held accountable. And even then, the guy ended up just getting a mere 18 months in jail. According to author Larry D. Ball, the outcome of this case proved to be a turning point in Horn's career in that he, quote, resolved to abandon the court system. Instead, he adopted a more direct means of suppressing rustling, including threats, intimidation, harassment, and expulsion from his patrol area. If the ultimate punishment, assassination, was necessary, so be it. End quote. Rumors soon began to spread that Tom, due to the failure of the courts, was more than willing to take matters into his own hands in order to protect the rich cattle barons. If the law wouldn't take care of the rustlers, then by God, Tom Horn would. For the right price, of course. And you better believe things were about to get real bloody there in southeastern Wyoming, which we will discuss in depth next week. Thank you so much for listening. Hey, do me a favor. If you enjoyed this episode, if it brought you any type of value, please feel free to head on over to buymeacoffee.com/Wild West and buy me a coffee, or 2 or 10. Or you can just head on over to wildwestextra.com and hit that little yellow icon that looks like a coffee cup. And please, do not forget to sign up for that 14-day free trial with MyHeritage, the leading global service when it comes to family history research. Click that link down below or scan the QR code now to get started. Who knows? Maybe you'll find out that you're related to some of the historical figures we discussed here on the show. All right, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening. And I will see you here next week when we continue on with the saga of Tom Horn. Adios.